Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar, Managing Risk and Oversight in Decentralized Clinical Trials Using Industry Standards, presented by the Avoca Group. I'm Amy Gutzler, Production Director at EXL Events, and I'll be moderating this webinar. Our speaker today is Dennis Salotti, Chief Operating Officer at the Avoca Group. You may read his full bio on the left side of your window by selecting the Speaker tab. Just a few technical notes before we begin. The webcast is being streamed through your computer, so there is no dial-in number. For the best audio quality, please make sure your volume is all the way up. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand within 24 hours after the event. Time permitting, we will allow the presentation, follow the presentation, with a Q&A session. Please submit your questions using the Question and Answers tab on the left side of your screen. Okay, now let's begin. Dennis, please go ahead.
Thanks, Amy. So just to set the table for what we're going to cover in the next, say, 45 minutes to 50 minutes before we hit the Q&A, we've got 4 objectives, and I want to break these out. And the first 2 are more around situational analysis. So we're going to look at the state of the industry. We're going to talk about where the industry is in terms of what they're using or what they're planning to use in terms of new and emerging technologies. And these are technologies that specifically enable decentralized trials. We're going to cherry pick a few of those. And then we're going to look at the challenges and opportunities and some of the impact that's perceived by the industry on use or potential use of those. And that's really characterizing the situation. Then we're going to switch gears and get into resources and solutions in the latter 2 bullets. So we're going to talk about what are the efforts going on right now and happening in the future around pre-competitive collaboratives to increase adoption and scale use of new and emerging technologies in clinical trials and to enable decentralized trials. And then we're going to look at, at least one case study of sort of efficient approaches to how to qualify decentralized solution providers specifically. I'm going to use the term throughout, decentralized clinical trials, because FDA has been using that terminology. I know that virtual and other formats have been used. More recently, I've been reading a lot more communication from FDA where they specifically use that terminology. So for the purposes of just a common vocabulary, understand that when I say DCTs or decentralized trials, synonymous with virtual trials. All right, so we'll start with the state of the industry data, and all of the data you see here is based on Avoca's 2018 industry survey. So we ran some research at the end of 2018 in the 4th quarter, and we're presenting some of those findings here. This can all be found in a lot more data than what I'll show today on the Avoca website. There's a report, it's free to download, that gets more deeper into this. But what we're going to do is cherry pick and step through a few key findings. So the first and the big headline around this research is that, and apologies for this alliterative reference, but we're in what I consider kind of a perpetual pilot paradox. So we ran some research in 2015 that paralleled this research I'm presenting now. And we asked people about 3 key dimensions of how they were embracing novel data sources and new technologies. And what we found when we looked at our data that we just captured in 4th quarter of last year with the data from 2015 is that there were some interesting changes across those 3 years. So we saw a 12% increase in the percentage of sponsors willing to try and fail in looking at different and pursuing different innovative approaches to clinical development, right? So decentralized trials among those. We saw that there was more willingness to experiment. When we asked about investment of whether it be dollars or people in terms of resources, other assets into innovative approaches, we saw that there was an even greater increase. There was a 20 percentage point increase in the number of sponsors, sponsor respondents indicating that. What was interesting and what generates kind of the paradoxical kind of situation we're in around this is that when we asked about, well, when your company, does your company actually then recognize and adopt those approaches? And the interesting twist to this is specifically we asked about those that were shown to be successful. So we made sure that, we're talking only about the ones where we hit success in the pilot. Did you recognize that success? Did you adopt that, that approach? And we actually saw a few percentage point decrease. So, almost what you would characterize as a regression. So despite being willing to do the experiments and risk failure, despite making investment and putting resources to it, when we actually hit upon success, we weren't seeing those scale up. We weren't seeing those, into broad, more widespread adoption. And so that's the paradox. So there's got to be something in the way. And I'd like to do a quick experiment just while we're on the call now. If you could, please respond to this polling question. I'll read the question aloud. We'll give about 30 seconds, and then we'll check out the results. Thinking about the challenges at your company today in adopting novel data sources, new technologies, and other approaches to clinical trials, which of these challenges do you encounter? And you're free to select all that apply. So this isn't where you have to pick your top challenge. Just pick the challenges that are most prominent in your mind in the next 30 seconds, top of mind, for this one specifically. And we'll give folks a moment to enter those responses. I know this one has a lot of response options, so we'll give maybe 45 seconds instead of 30 seconds this time. It looks like, yeah, we're still going strong. We'll go 10 more seconds, so keep clicking. Okay, I'm seeing it slow down, so we're going to move on. If you didn't get a chance to respond to this one or fully respond, don't worry. We have a few more polls, one coming up in a few slides and another one towards the end. So let's look at the results. So what pops out? So this is interesting. So system integration challenges at 67%. So 67% of the folks on the call right now found that integration is a challenge. Regulatory and legal and compliance, right? So two prominent themes, 51% each of those. And then we see data security, IT, and culture as the other top spot, around 50%. So calling out, that's probably about the top 5 I think I just named. We're looking at compliance challenges, whether they be legal or regulatory, integration challenges, very pragmatic, data security, and culture. So let's see now in the next slide kind of how that maps to the results. So I present this slide after that poll because I didn't want to anchor anyone or bias you to any response, but we asked this question 2 different ways. So the first way we asked was a little bit different than the exercise we just went through. The first way was in what we call an unaided response. So we just said, hey, tell us, what is your biggest challenge without, providing any options. And what we saw rise to the top in some of the commentary, and I'm not going to read them, but you can see some representative quotes there, is some of the same things we just saw in the poll we just did. So we saw a bit of integration. That was a top theme, as well as cultural challenges, which we saw in the poll just previously, but also that cost, very pragmatic theme around the cost of implementing these sorts of technologies, as well as a lack of experience or familiarity with them, and a risk perception that came along with that, right? So this little bit of the fear of the unknown. The interesting thing is, while we saw cost and culture, the other C word that we usually, that we saw in the previous poll and that we didn't see here was compliance. And it was interesting to me that wasn't a top of mind or unaided vocalization of a theme for why we can't adopt these things. But when we look at the aided results, now this question was positioned exactly how you received it on the poll today. We saw very similar to results, and we actually didn't see cost as one of those, even despite it being among some of the challenges we put out there. So we saw system integration rise to the top, just like we saw in the results today. Legal compliance and regulatory, again, top spots, just like we saw in culture. Now, the survey that we did was hundreds of people within the industry, cutting across CROs, sponsors, other non-CRO providers, sponsors of all different genres, from pre-revenue all the way to the large blue chip pharmas. Probably very representative of what we have on the webinar today. And so it doesn't surprise me that these results map, but it validates kind of that, what we saw in the data from fourth quarter has not changed, and now that we're entering fourth quarter today. So this data is very relevant, very real, and these challenges and the situation we're in is very real. So now let's kind of get a little bit more specific around decentralized trials. I'd like to do another poll right here. This is a much easier one. You only have to pick one option. So we'll give 20 to 30 seconds around this one. What is your current experience with decentralized trials? So we want to kind of understand, have you not used these at all? Are you familiar with them, but you're not planning on using them? You just kind of know about it or interested in it? Are you familiar with them and planning to try them out, or are you familiar and actually have used or have engaged in some of these? And this is, not to be a spoiler, but we'll look at some data from the survey on that. but I'd like to understand just for the audience today kind of where the experience and familiarity level is. So I'll give it another 10 seconds. If you haven't picked, you got to commit. Okay, we'll move on now. Again, we've got another poll coming up later in the webinar. So if you didn't get to this one, there's another opportunity. So we see here, about 25% completely lack familiarity with this, and it's a relatively new concept, decentralized trials. So that's that's not surprising. And then another about 30%, 29% familiar and planning to use. And then the remainder making up those who are not planning or have planned and are using. And then we actually have some folks that don't know, or it's not really applicable. So it may not be something that's maybe more informational to them. It may not be something that maybe just you're starting your education around decentralized trials. So when we asked a similar question at the industry level, we found some very similar things. So we saw roughly around that same amount. We talked to them just about virtual or siteless trials, kind of the same proportions in terms of maybe slightly more usage, but the same proportions around either not familiar and not planning to use, or planning to use, familiar and planning to use. So we broke that out a little bit more granularly to really understand, kind of more around the dynamic of that. We saw some slightly higher usage around virtual or siteless trials, or decentralized trials with larger pharma than smaller pharma. That may be because there's larger portfolios at larger firms. There's a lot, and so they may have a more diverse portfolio where decentralized approaches are almost mandated in certain therapy areas or indications, or there may be greater infrastructure to support, the change management and the movement to use and the investment to use and try and experiment with some of those different decentralized approaches. We didn't get to specific reasoning around that. That'll be subject to further research, but those are some of the inferences that we made from that data. The interesting thing, though, is that when we look at the provider base compared to the sponsor, so providers in this survey encompassed both CROs and non-CRO providers, but the population was about 75% represented by CROs. So, so a heavily CRO-influenced population. We see relatively less familiarity in use, but a very strong signal around familiarity and plans to use. And so there's been some question around, well, why is that? Why do we see this difference in sponsors if there's such a prevalent amount of outsourcing going on, and we know that sponsors and CROs work together on these sorts of endeavors. And this, I think, contributes to what we defined earlier in terms of there being this paradox of experimentation and investment, but not necessarily broad scale up. When we think about the biggest piece of again, this is a heavily CRO-driven sample, we think about the biggest piece of their portfolio of business, their book of business, it's around large trials, it's around pivotal trials, it's around phase 2 and beyond. So when you think about where some of the experimentation is happening and the way in which, we know anecdotally sponsors are approaching some of these decentralized approaches or more emerging technologies that enable decentralized approaches, more often than not, it's happening off critical path for an asset. We're not putting primary endpoint data in the hands of something very new. That's, that's a bit too risky. We're doing them perhaps within innovation groups, or as translational medicine groups, or digital marker development groups, areas that are off the critical path perhaps, or, on a different risk pathway than some of the rest of our portfolio, and thus they don't make up as much of the CRO's portfolio, and thus you see here a relatively less experience with them, but a very high amount of prevalence of planning and optimism around using, and we'll see some optimism in the next slide, around using some of these technologies. And when we think about what are the jobs of our partners, in terms of CROs especially, a lot of their focus is driving operations in the trial. So keep getting patients in, keeping patients in the trials, right? And and moving the data from patient to site to to sponsor. There's obviously a big pressure on them to execute on that, and so they look at these enabling capabilities when we're talking about decentralized trials. So that's something to consider. We're also showing some wearables data here. this is one example of what we consider an enabling modality, right? So wearable different sensor data, things that allow mobile data capture, passive data capture, modalities that are employed in the context of decentralized trials. Not the only modality. One example of one, as I mentioned, there's more in the report, and there's more, that were probably not captured in the report that exists in the world today. So just an example there, and showing the parallel and how that kind of moves with the adoption and the planning and use of virtual or siteless trials, how those things are a bit moving in the same direction. So I'm going to move on to impact. So you mentioned I alluded to some optimism. So one of the things we wanted to understand, and we asked in this research, is really what's the industry's perception around where emerging technologies, new data sources, things that will be used in the context of decentralized trials, plausibly, what sort of impact would these have on different attributes of, different benefits, essentially, or perceived benefits? And what we found was, if we just look at the top two and bottom two, just for the purposes of our webinar today, there was a strong signal around having positive impact on getting more value out of the data collected, right? So, being able to run more valuable clinical trials, being able to support scientific investigations into the development of new medicines from with better understanding, right? With better data, with things that drive greater insight into what's happening. There was also the second, top pick was around being proactive around quality and compliance. And this is really interesting because compliance with using the technologies from a regulatory standpoint, from a legal and patient privacy standpoint, we saw in our poll today, from an IT and data security standpoint, those sorts of things were perceived as challenges, and yet where we see an impact that they could have is actually helping us be more proactive around improving data quality and improving compliance. And this makes sense, right? When you think about it, some of the technologies that are being used or being, planned to be used in the context of a decentralized trial resolve some of the inadequacies, if you will, of older forms of data capture. So I came from a background in running an e-color company. So one of the classics is, what they would call the parking lot effect, where someone would fill out a paper diary, a patient would fill out their paper take-home diary in the parking lot before walking into the clinic. And in that context, with pen and paper, you don't have an electronic date and time signature. You don't know where that, where or when that assessment was captured. Whereas with different forms of electronic modalities, ones that are available today with ePro, but also ones that could be even less intrusive on a patient's life with wearables and other, sensors that are more passive data capture, you have, better handle on where and when that data was captured, and you can even remove the patient compliance aspect, and that you're not relying on them to hear an alert and to receive an alert and to do an ePro assessment. You may be capturing some of that data around how they're moving or were they able to get out of bed or some of these things through the use of sensors that passively capture digital biomarkers that are able to be surrogates for those sorts of activities. So there's tremendous opportunity around the data quality and compliance. That's just one example that I wanted to highlight. And we're seeing that vocalized in this survey in terms of impact. What we're seeing, though, on the flip side, if we look at the bottom two, is that mitigating risk and reducing costs of clinical trials, which are also relevant aims for anyone in clinical operations or in any way associated with the execution of clinical trials, those are found to have, on a relative basis, less impact by virtue of using some of these technologies. And this makes sense because when we think about it, we're doing something new, right? And we saw in the survey that we did with the industry, but also in our poll today, that culture and mindset and lack of familiarity is something that we have to overcome. So a perception of risk around something could become a barrier, but there also is some degree of positive impact it could have. So in the example we just mentioned, patient compliance as a risk to having good data quality, good data integrity, could be mitigated by use of these technologies, but by introducing them, there's other things that come up, right? There's working with new solutions providers who perhaps don't have experience in this space and making sure that they are adequate by training, experience, and education to do the job that they're employed to do. There could be new data privacy concerns like we saw in the survey. There could be additional data security concerns. Maybe there's data quality concerns, moving data from device to, to a provider, to the sponsor database, at some point. All those kind of data transfers and making sure that nothing gets changed in the process and keeping a valid state around all of that. That introduces new potential risks and things that we now have to proactively plan and execute upon. So nothing that's insurmountable, but a risk nonetheless. And finally, reducing costs. So there's well-published data around the cost of clinical trials, and influencing that by introducing new technology. It's generally counterintuitive. You don't think that by adding these technologies it would reduce costs. There may be an opportunity that with sufficient use and scale that they can costs can be offset. So for instance, with decentralized trials, reducing the number of in-clinic visits. But that aspect of things, there's two opposing forces there, right? There's the cost of technology, cost of the support model to back it up when you're going direct to patients, other associated costs, and then there's the offset by what you may be taking away by using those. So you can see here that there's a temperance around, how cost reduction will be an impact for using some of these technologies. And we see that expressed here on a relative basis, that it being on the bottom. So let's pause there. We just completed our kind of first two objectives. We just did a nice roundabout, both in the audience and looking at some of the industry data. We did a really comprehensive characterization of the situation. So we've satisfied our situation analysis objectives. I want to pause now to prompt for questions. So we've got a Q&A little section there. You can add questions. Those get brought over to our moderators that are managing the back end of this, and they'll be able to tee those up so we can answer those on the in the final 10 minutes or so of the presentation. So please use that Q&A bar. We just covered a bunch of content. If you have questions on the data or on the situation or want to weigh in with a comment, please add those there, and we'll try to bring those in the last 10 minutes. But I'll give folks just a moment to do that, and then we'll get into some solution, and we'll get into talk about how collaboratives within the industry are a vehicle to help us with some of these challenges, to help us with the transformation to decentralized trials, hopefully to get us out of the paradox that we just discussed. Okay. So I'm going to start with a bit of a provocative statement, and I'll caveat this by saying I'm very much a systems thinker, and that's sometimes that leads to these sort of provocative statements. So we're not, at some level, we are not really the beautiful and unique snowflakes we may think we are. Above a certain level of nuance that's maybe inherent in the asset you're developing, the medicine you're developing, inherent in a specific trial. If you bring things up to a high enough level, you realize that there's more things that are the same than different, right? That is the level that we're going to talk at. We're going to speak at for the remainder of this webinar. And this is where, my hypothesis and what we're putting out there for this is how we use platforms for collaboration as a vehicle for progress. And if we look around ourselves, if we look outside of the industry, and we'll step through a quick example and then get back into the industry. If we think about how we organize ourselves, I think it becomes readily apparent. If we think within our company how we organize ourselves, right? We use apps like Slack or Teams, Microsoft Teams. We try to create open floor plans, which I know that's probably a very a partisan issue on whether that's okay or not. But we have interdisciplinary project teams. We try to engineer ourselves or organize ourselves both in technology and physical layouts and how we structure teams to be collaborative. When we think about collaboration outside of the walls of our company, though, we think about the industry. That's where we need a different mechanism. We need a different framework, and that's where we rely on pre-competitive collaboratives. And we're not alone in that. If you look at other companies, other industries rather, other verticals. If you look at aviation, so this was an interesting one that stands out to me, not so much because I travel a bunch, but because there's groups of pre-competitive collaboratives in a highly competitive industry. So, whether it's ATAG or CETA or, the Star Alliance, for those of you like me that fly United, quite a bit, you know, these are all pre-competitive collaboratives around the aviation industry. If you look at the requirements, if you look at the things that, you know, that aviation is dealing with, right? Well, they have to focus on the customer experience the same way we really are obligated to focus on the patient experience, especially moving forward. You know, for those of you that are familiar, there was a time, and probably still is a bit of a time, where customer experience isn't exactly the highest priority for people in, you know, for the airline industry. And I would argue that patient experience is just emerging to be sort of something that we're really dedicating focus to now in the clinical trials industry. If we look at how they've been influenced by disruptive technologies, they've had to deal with mobile devices, right? We all remember having to shut down our phones and Kindles, and now we can actually leave our phones and Kindles on, you know, to some extent. They've had to deal with the internet itself. So the internet was extremely disruptive towards airlines for their pricing models, right? And so there's Kayak and all these other things. There's ways, you know, that directly impacted their pricing and how they go to market. And they've had some pretty notable, and this ties in with the customer experience element, issues around how social media has impacted them, right? And so they've had some disruptive events, some externalities that have impacted them. They're also highly regulated. They only really differ from us in maybe one letter, right? They have the FAA, we have the FDA. So very highly regulated industry. They're faced with rising costs in the context of really, you know, some downward price pressure because of the competition in the industry and because of the transparency around pricing we just mentioned. And safety is an essential component of what they do, right? You know, so if we look at those same sorts of challenges, and we just put ourselves now in the context of this for clinical trials and specifically decentralized trials, we see that we've got a customer experience, you know, thing to tackle, right? We have to have access to trials. We have to have acceptability. We're trying to focus on patient centricity and make more people want to participate to address our enrollment challenges. We've been disrupted by technology. Most notably, you know, when we think about, it's more of an opportunity in terms of a disruptor right now than a challenge, but the things that all the enabling technologies that we've discussed thus far and that are in that research report around mobile and around how those are enablers to decentralized trials, we're influenced by those. We're also highly regulated. How we are doing clinical trials in a decentralized trial versus a traditional trial, that how kind of changes, but there's no lower bar for decentralized trials in terms of their level of compliance that's mandated and the level of quality management and safety, and safety and oversight and all the things that we need to do. So we still stay in a highly regulated environment. We're faced with rising costs. We know that. We know that that's actually a challenge that's been vocalized in terms of, you know, bringing in some of these enabling technologies, and we know that that safety, specifically in this context, clinical trial participant and patient safety is essential, right? Data, you know, quality defined as data integrity and patient safety, right? When we're talking about how do we manage quality, those are the two main things we're looking at, is how do we ensure patient safety, how do we ensure data integrity. And we've got groups. If we look on the right side, we've got different groups. So we've got we've got CDISC as an example of one collaborative that has been very successful in driving standards within this industry, right? And so that's our exemplar of that. We've seen Citi and Transcelerate and DIME and the Avoca Quality Consortium. And obviously, you know, speaking from where I sit, I'm going to focus a little bit more on what our Quality Consortium is doing. But the point is, there's different collaboratives focused in different areas that are helping to move the needle forward. And this is the collaboratives at the industry level or the vehicle to bring about transformation. Once you've brought that, once that's kind of happened, once they can move the needle on that, it makes it much more easily within a company to then tackle some of the other challenges we saw, like mindset and getting comfortable with, you know, and mitigating some of the risk and such. So just a word on the Avoca Quality Consortium in case there's anyone who isn't familiar on the call. So a couple of key points. It's a multi-stakeholder collaborative, which isn't always the case with collaboratives, but in the case of the Avoca Quality Consortium, it's purposefully designed to include sponsors and sponsors of all different genres, CROs, non-CRO clinical service providers, and other sorts of organizations that are engaged in clinical trial execution. Its foundation is really in collaboration. Collaboration is the base for which we do everything, and that's why we have the multi-stakeholder format, because we realize there's interdependencies between those different players in the system, and we need to leverage those interdependencies as opportunities and use those in a proactive, collaborative approach to get things done. And so what we layer on top of that is the research, is the insight that we gain from doing research. And we stepped through some of it earlier in the talk. We do a lot of research within Avoca to really understand and to dig deep into some of the challenges that the industry is facing or that are coming out. And we use that insight to influence then the development of leading practice, and then some pragmatic tools and things that help operationalize that practice. So that's just the 30-second on the Quality Consortium and on kind of how it mobilizes around things in general. I'll show this just to give a visual. So there's over 100 companies in the consortium. Again, this shows the diversity, and the two key takeaways here is just the diversity with which the consortium is made up, but also to give and this is a bit of an eye chart because there's over 100 companies. But if you see your organization there and you didn't know, you came into this webinar not knowing you were a member, your company was a member, it's an enterprise license, so you have access to all the resources if your company's on there. And if your company's not on there, there's you can check out our website. But that's just to raise awareness that you may have access to some of the resources and the research and the things we were discussing already and not actually know it. So I'll come back to that research theme now. And one of the findings from our research, was around the compliance, and we saw this in the survey we just did on, just within this call about the regulatory and other compliance challenges in being a block. We also know that 96% of the amendments to R2 were around quality oversight. So if we had to help define what one of the risk areas is, or one of the concerns around being compliant is, it's around, well, how do I evaluate and how do I provide oversight and how do I ensure compliance, specifically with some of these newer sorts of technology providers, newer sorts of technologies, newer types of data sources that I'm working with. And so we took it upon us as a mission to do a few things to really address that need for regulatory compliance by developing these fit-for-purpose frameworks and tools and practices to help enable that. So we carved that out as our specific niche, as our specific mission to address the situation that we described so in such a detailed manner in the first 20 minutes or so of the webinar. Now, another key takeaway I want to put around this is, and this is specific to using collaboratives as a vehicle and standards as a vehicle to move the needle on decentralized trials and other areas, is it's necessary for collaboratives to really pick a focus, and the best collaboratives do this really well. We're not helping, Avoca is not tackling picking the right digital biomarker. Citi and to an extent DIME have some really good resources around that, right? Citi's got a decision tree and things like that. So picking which digital biomarker you should tackle, or whether you should even use a digital biomarker in your trial, there's a collaborative that's focused on that. We're not doing that. When you're thinking about data standards, and you're thinking about, and this was a question that came up in another webinar I recently participated in, was, how do we ensure data standards across all, that system integration challenge that we saw in the survey and in the polling. How do I address that? How do I make sure that all my data is consistent, that it's following a common standard, those sorts of things? Well, you have CDISC. You have CDISC, you have HL7 with the FHIR standards for other types of health data. There's other organizations that are just laser focused on the development of standards specifically around data. So the key point here is really that collaboratives have specific focuses and specific remits. And for Avoca, we're really focused on the regulatory compliance and oversight aspects of it. And so that's the piece that we're going to tackle. When you're going out and looking at using collaboratives and using standards as a vehicle to move this forward in your organization, understand that it's not going to be one collaborative that does it all for you. You're probably going to need to look at different resources, different troves of resources that are provided for by different collaboratives with those specific remits. So I'll get a little bit deeper on what Avoca has committed to doing through our Quality Consortium. So this isn't a one and done. This is a 3-year initiative. When we looked at this, and where things are, it became, we recognize this as a multi-year initiative beginning with the creation of standards. So using standards as the foundation and drive other things. And so in 2019, and I'll talk about how we do this and then get into kind of where we are and show an example of what's available. We've driven towards standards for qualifying providers and enabling technology working in remote, digital, and decentralized trials. So you can see the reflection here, a couple different, terms to reflect decentralized trials here and the technologies that support them. So we have a vendor qualification or a provider qualification work stream. It's been ongoing for a while. I'll show a little bit about that in a moment. And so we pumped this challenge into that work stream to really, to tackle definition of standards around some of these, to really understand what good looks like, what compliant looks like, to help move the needle forward. In 2020, we anticipate some of that work's going to continue, but then once you have those standards, we can create some fit-for-purpose quality and risk management frameworks. So once we have our hands around that, we can create the frameworks and the leading practice around some of these things to address some of the challenges around risk and compliance and ensuring quality. And then by 2021, we intend to really focus on outcomes. So tracking outcomes, understanding how is the industry, progressing in their transformation around this? How are these tools and practices and standards functioning to support that? So really being more outcomes based. And that's going to take a little while because as we saw from the data and the poll today, there's a lot of plans to use some of the, these approaches, the decentralized approaches, but it's not a highly prevalent use. So it's going to take some time for that adoption to occur. So just to say a word around the provider qualification initiative, and this is the work stream I've referenced. The idea around this is really to focus on a highly rigorous set of standards and use those to then build out the tools and processes and downstream things that come from that. And the idea is that with this, you've got increased transparency. You know what good looks like. We know what's a regulatory requirement or recommended by ICH or some other guidance document, and what is industry practice and what is, those sorts of things. And by having that transparency, that's what, and understanding that, you can reduce risk, you can drive efficiency, there's a greater understanding between providers, sponsors, the people developing technologies, what needs to happen. So that's the goal for that initiative. And it follows a content development plan and process similar to what we do with all AQC leading practices. So without getting into the super deep details of this, we spend a lot of time collecting and curating information. So we ask our members to contribute some things around industry practice. We also go out and do the heavy lifting around regulations, guidance, guidelines, guidance documents, technical papers. We attend conferences. We gather information through all these different channels, and then we synthesize that, right? So in the context of this, it's, it's around what does it mean to be compliant, the use of a mobile-enabled technology for a decentralized trial, whether you're using mobile nursing, whether you're using wearables, whether you're using some other modality. And we synthesize together, well, what is the composite framework of standards? And we interpret in some cases where interpretation is necessary, what's in a regulation or a guidance into what that means in terms of a standard. And then we put that out and we give that for review. So we have some dedicated, which I'll show in a moment, dedicated teams internally, but also dedicated teams amongst our members. So, a special interest group, if you will, that focuses really deeply on this, on these sorts of things, and reviews and comments, almost like the FDA does a comment period on a guidance. There's a comment period that happens on these internally, and then we bring them out to industry. We bring them out to the providers who may not be members of our consortium, but have stake in providing some of these services to get there and have domain expertise in this and get their input on it. And then we bring them back in and we publish them and provide them back to our members. But the important thing is this last box around updating. We also steward these, and especially for decentralized trials as a more volatile or area where there's a great deal more change, we spend a lot of time curating and keeping sure that those are up to date. So just in a flash, you can see here, this is the work that's been done to date on that work stream. We initially started with core requirements, so things, standards, and things that were germane to all providers in the clinical space, doesn't matter who you are, so things like having a quality management system or your project management, those sort, your physical, logical security, those sorts of things. And then we did a deep dive into technical services, tackling first the very common primary, kind of endpoint generating services. So ECOA, imaging, biomarker labs, and other forms of lab services. And then by request of our members, started to tackle functional services. So the services that wrap around those endpoints, right? So medical writing, clinical monitoring, data management, biostat, those sorts of things. And now in 2019, we're tackling wearables, specifically actigraphy, because there's a variety of different sensors you can employ. E-health records, right? So mining EHRs for purposes of recruitment or assessing feasibility. Digital technologies like eReg binders and e-consents, and I'll show an example of the eReg binder one in a moment. And then under the umbrella of decentralized trials, mobile healthcare professional visits, right? So your mobile nursing type visits, and that's one of a multitude of things that would fall under that umbrella of decentralized trials. We are at the point of completion or in review with many of these. You can see what's available, what's been completed thus far. We've got one more quarter to go in the year with many things wrapping up. But this is where we are in terms of that process I laid out and some of the areas that we committed to tackling. So if you saw your name on that logo, if you're interested in these sorts of things, some of these are available, some of these are available for review, and some of these will be coming up very soon. I hope this is readable, if you can see it, but this is a snippet. So this is an example from the eReg binder and investigator site file standard. So this is what a standard looks like. We talk about standards, but what do they look like? Well, we give them unique IDs. They're given a brief identifier, so you understand what might be in there. And then there is the actual standard, and then importantly the traceability to where it came from. So in this case, regulatory or guidance, the regulation or guidance source. And you can see, so if we look at binder preservation, and you see there's Part 11 requirements in there, there's ICH requirements in there, and the one below it around task management, there's references to the EMA TMF guidance. The other important thing I'll note here is if you were to read some of these or look at some of these, while these are specific to the use of eReg, electronic reg binders, for instance, there are things that are common to core requirements. So when we're talking about binder preservation, we're talking about records management. When we're talking about task management and workflow, we're talking about aspects of project management. So many of these are more specific nuance applied to existing requirements that we have captured in our core requirements of all providers, and that you probably have familiarity with just from your history in running clinical trials and understanding the clinical trial space. So again, in the interest of, at some level, not being a beautiful and unique snowflake, many of the requirements only change in a very subtle way due to context. And I think by looking at what we know, what applies in other contexts that we're more familiar with, it's a very strong bridge to understand how we might think about them in these newer and slightly different contexts. So just to kind of give a visual for these ones that I just showed specifically, that group of things that's either complete or almost complete, we had 25 companies participate in generating those. Those are our advisory board members, represented by 34 people. We went outside the industry. Many of these, or some of them are members. Many of these are not members of AQC. So we went out to industry partners to do reviews. For that eReg one, I know Florence Healthcare played a big part in reviewing. So thanking our advisory board members as well as the out-of-industry partners. And of course, a big thank you to the team that worked on it. This work, while I can, do a synopsis of it in a few slides, is a tremendous body of work. It takes a tremendous amount of effort. And as you can see here, we have a team of people that worked very diligently to execute on that. And so just wanted to acknowledge their efforts as well. So the next question, and this is going to tee up our last poll for the session, is really around standards and tools for the next year. So we've got some ideas kicking around, again, hearing feedback from people, talking to members, talking to folks at industry conferences and other areas on what the hot areas are where additional standards and tools may be useful if we were to embark upon those. So here's a couple that we have kicking around. And I'd like to just tee up this poll now and ask you, as members of industry, what would you find the most value to your company in terms of having greater standards around? Because as a collaborative and as a group that develops standards to help move the industry move forward, your voice from industry helps us prioritize and gives us direction. So again, selecting one of those options. It's eTMF, electronic trial master file, mobile sensor devices other than actigraphy, so respiration, heart rate, biomarkers, glucose, telemedicine type visits, electronic health records as an e-source specifically to populate ECRF. And again, touches on that FHIR standard we mentioned earlier. And then, specifically IMP around, doing direct to patient, direct from patient IMP, how you manage that. So I'm going to let this go just a little bit. Okay, we're going to move this forward in the interest of time. I'm going to give a little bit less time this time only because I want to stay on target so we can do some Q&A. Yeah, so it looks like, so it's interesting. It looks like eTMF and EHR is in a tie. I can tell you, eTMF seems to come up again and again. And it's interesting to me because there is a reference model around it. So I think that, the nuance around that is really looking at not so much the eTMF itself, but probably around the solutions providers and, how do you evaluate or how do you know a good solution provider around eTMF. But that's something we'll have to dig deeper into. This validates some of the feedback we've been getting. So thank you for sharing that. So I'll get into one case example. We're going to do probably 2 minutes on this and then jump into Q&A. So again, this is another prompt. If you have not already entered some Q&A questions, please tee those up in the Q&A box and we'll take them as they come. I see a bunch in there already, so thank you for those who have already contributed. But we'll talk about one example, and this is an example of how standards enable operationalization of other things that that help move the industry forward. It's how, where standards become the platform, and again, standards being the work of a pre-competitive collaborative, bringing together the industry to get those built, and then what you can do with those once they're out there. So within Avoca, we had developed these standards. We developed some tools that were associated with these standards. And the feedback we kind of got was, it's great to be able to do those and put those out there. But my real need is a little bit farther than that, like a blank template, around an RFI or, a set of standards, 30 pages of standards is really good. But I'll tell you, what I would really like is to be able to have a readily available completed RFI template or a readily available assessment of a provider against those standards. That would really move the ball forward towards the goal line. So when we started to delve into this, again, using, our research as a vehicle for that, what we recognize is we've got this many-to-many relationship here on the left, right? That's the way the current legacy process is. And this kind of paradigm has actually recently been characterized in some work we did with Tufts, a Tufts study that Avoca collaborated on. So keep your ears and eyes open for that. That's been presented recently at another EXL event. So you're at the Clinical Quality Oversight Forum, you may have heard it, but there's some data emerging on this that characterize. I'm not going to get into it here, but just know that that's out there and keep your eyes open for that as we disseminate those findings. But there's this many-to-many relationship that just struck us as completely dysfunctional and inefficient. And what we envisioned was something a little bit simpler. So answering the need of our members and our clients and folks that, had said to us, what would really move the ball forward. Well, we could create the infrastructure, that centralized resource where the standards are operationalized and something that people can respond to or that can be assessed against. And that information is then available in a considerate, controlled manner to firms that want to work with those providers, right? So sponsors pouring in, to pick up information that's maintained against a set of standards by a third party, and the providers are then pouring their information in, and then that helps them work together more efficiently, more transparently, and in a higher quality, more compliant manner. So what this really manifests in, and what's out there today now is an app essentially, right? Is a platform. So it helps, people organize. So, where are they in this process and their providers? who's available in that space, where, you know, can I learn more about them? Can I get their RFIs? When we think about the digital space, when we think about the very complex ecosystem of technologies and providers enabling decentralized trials, it's hard to get your arms around. You can walk around conference exhibit floors, you can do some of these things, but it's really hard, and it takes a lot of time and effort. This is this essentially, this platform enables you to organize that, enables you to learn more about them by accessing some information around them. And then finally, if you need to get, when you're further down the pipeline, it gives you a mechanism to then go out and have them assessed, again, against those standards. So it all ties back to standards that have been developed by, in a very rigorous manner by a consortium that represents the industry, and then operationalizing that to help make things happen. So just a quick case study around that as we wind down to the end of the webinar. So we've got a few minutes left. I'm going to move it now and pause for a minute for questions. And I think we probably have a few in queue, but I'll turn it over. Amy, I think you were gonna curate some of these questions. So let me pause for a minute and give you a chance to hop in.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Dennis. Now we're going to move on to the Q&A. As Dennis said, there is still some time to submit your questions using the Q&A tab on the left side of your screen. We do have a lot of great questions already, and we'll get to as many as possible. The first question, Dennis, is what is the biggest risk when working with virtualized trials?
So that's a good question, and I think and I hate to answer things this way, right? But I'll start with a very broad answer, and then I'll try to get a specific example. And the answer is it depends, right? So, and this isn't just me, hedging an answer. This is if you read, if you go on FDA's website and you look at, patient-centered drug development, you look at some of, the ECOA stuff and some of the other, kind of new and, mobile technologies and some of the things they have out there and some of their guidance, there's a very specific focus on them saying, listen, think about what you're doing. And this is actually in the ePro guidance, in the patient-reported outcomes guidance from, I think, 2009. So it's not new news. They're very specific around, think about what you're doing. Think about the patient population you're in. Think about the therapy area. Think about what that patient journey looks like. So they're very focused. They're focused on telling you, look at the context. And when we counsel our clients in doing any form of risk assessment, whether it's decentralized or other sorts of context, we always kind of start with, well, think about what you're doing. There's the risks that are out there that are just general risks that are going to be ever present in clinical research, only because you're doing clinical research. But then what you really need to understand is what are the risks that are unique to your trial, to your patient population, to your trial design, to the types of endpoints you're capturing, and those sorts of things. So in a way, what is the biggest risk? Well, it depends, right? And that's a thing that you have to determine with your team. One of the things that I'll share that's just on my radar, around these things is we're working with a lot, we're seeing an increase in the complexity and volume of solutions providers. And, we're seeing the combination of different things together to form a value chain to be able to capture data, visualize data, move data, into our databases, and be able to report out on it. There's a couple of things that come to mind around that. I think, focusing on the data chain of custody and understanding how data is moving, when data transfers are happening, and making sure that data integrity is maintained between those things and that you have validated that throughout that process and that chain of custody. That's an important thing, because what that's going to lead you to is, really understanding, do you have the right, do you have any critical breaks in that process? And I'll give you an example. So when you have a patient, they're using a device, they're using a wearable device, let's say a continuous glucose monitor. Well, what if they have trouble with that? It begs the question, well, what's the support model for that patient? Have you thought about that? Is it to phone the site? Well, okay, that's an easy answer. If it's to phone the site, are the sites staffed adequately to be technicians? Are they educated to be able to help troubleshoot these issues? Would they contact the manufacturer of the device if they needed help? Or, do you need to have a third party that gives, round the clock or, or some sort of nuanced support? That'll kind of lead you to, depending on what you do around that, well, to really understand, okay, well, how, are we protecting patient privacy? What information can be shared, what can't be shared? How do we make sure we don't receive patient identifiers inadvertently and, in something. It'll bring you, if you follow that data chain of custody, it'll bring you to or lead you through this risk assessment that you need to do around all areas of your trial. The other thing I'd caution against, and then I'll be quick about this because I could go on for a long time, is just I've seen in whether you're doing Agile or GAMP5 or any of the more modern software development techniques, a lot of the tech providers, change control is tough. Like change control in Agile is tough. And I think if I had to give one area of risk around technology solutions, and specifically for decentralized trials where you might be seeing newer technology firms that aren't as familiar with clinical research requirements entering the space, I think understanding change control and maintenance of a validated state for the system for your trial, I think is something to focus on. Because if you're doing, if they're doing iterative, every 2 weeks they're sprinting and they're pushing out new things, it kind of begs the question, well, what sort of risks does that open up, in terms of validation for the system? And, do you have adequate change control over that? So I would just, and if they're coupling into that, use of a lot of third-party apps, or other things, looking at kind of what's their oversight over those providers and their change control, because it can introduce some systemic risk when their value chains, beyond, are even more complicated because they're using bits and pieces of different utilities or code or apps, that are behind their solution. So just thinking about it that way. Why don't we go to the next one, Amy? I could go on forever and ever for that.
Very good. Thank you. So I think the next one is more of a statement that maybe you can weigh in on. The question is, I think one of the main challenges is how to operationalize decentralized trials. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where we see people stymied, and I think that's where those challenges come into play. It's, I have to make it, so we look at cost, right? So I have to make a business case because at the end of the day, trials are getting more expensive. I have to convince, we have to convince senior leadership that investment in the space has a benefit. So that's a challenge. I think, how do we integrate, not even from a data integration perspective, but how do we do process integration? So how do we make sure that if we bring in, decentralized trials, that our legacy processes that were built around traditional site-based trials, are they ready to accept that, right? So, I think if I had a counsel on how do you operationalize, I think the first thing to do is really think about where your biggest wins are. I think it's looking at, and again, this goes back to context, what are you really trying to do? Do you actually need to do it? What is the impetus for decentralized trials? Is there a true need? And once there's a true need and you understand, very specifically on where the value levers are around leveraging a decentralized approach, that'll kind of unlock okay, well, these are the types of solutions. It'll lead you to, well, this is what we're spending now in terms of time, resources, dollars, those sorts of things. And you can start to have those conversations around, well, what do we anticipate or what would we need to achieve by using decentralized trials? How quickly do we think we can get there? And what are the experiments we need to do to feel comfortable about implementing them? That begins to flesh out this story, which essentially becomes a business case. It becomes this is the situation, here's the problem, this is the impact we could have with these, and here are the next steps we need to do, right? And, well, I call it a pilot paradox. There's nothing wrong with piloting. It's just piloting without a vision to how you're going to scale is a waste of time and money. You have to have those conversations and work right to left and understand what scale up needs to be and what you would need to achieve for that to set up the right experiment and a pilot to be able to get you there.
Perfect. And for the sake of time, this will be our final question. We did have a lot of great questions come in today, but we couldn't get to them all. We will try our best to get back to everyone who submitted these questions after the webinar. But Dennis, final question. Are there any standards or compliance measures regarding operational and QA for sponsor oversight of CRO quality during clinical trials?
Okay, so I think that's a broad one. I think that's that's broader than decentralized trials. But yeah, I mean, sponsors should have a quality management system. Avoca has, and this was developed in part through the Quality Consortium, a 12-component framework around quality management that takes into account oversight as one of those components. So it's a holistic quality framework, vendor oversight being one of those, CROs being considered a vendor on a clinical trial. More specific than that, there's a lot more elements, probably more than I could cover in here, but the answer is yes, there are standards. E6R2, starts to touch on some of those, but from a next layer down, sort of pragmatic, what should you have in terms of governance? What should you have in terms of, communication? What sort of documentation should you have to be able to recreate the story upon inspection? There are more specific tools, resources, standards around that. Transcelerate has a paper on QMS, I believe. Avoca has done an extensive work around QMS and has, in addition to some of the thought leadership, has a lot of pragmatic tools and templates and things that you can put into practice around that. So yes, the answer is yes, there are things out there. It just takes a little bit of hunting around to pick them up and bring them into your organization. The last statement I'll make around that is, again, it all depends on context. It's important to right size and to have that be fit for purpose for your organization. So what works for a Merck or a Pfizer isn't necessarily going to work for a pre-revenue biotech. So, internal analysis and, an introspection around what your organization can adopt is an important first step before looking externally to find those tools and bring them into your organization.
Very good. Now I just want to go to the next slide, Dennis, regarding upcoming webinars and conferences. I do want to call out that third line item, EXL's Virtual Clinical Trial Conference this December 2nd and 3rd in Philadelphia. Dennis will be joining us and presenting a session on collaborative approaches to managing risk and oversight using standards to support the transition from traditional to decentralized trials, where he will be adding new data and information that you will not want to miss. So thank you again, everyone, for attending this EXL Events webinar and submitting so many great questions. I'd like to take this time to thank Dennis and the Avoca Group for presenting on today's webinar. Again, this has been recorded, and you will have access to the recording within 24 hours using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. Thank you all again for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at future events. Thanks again, Dennis.
Thank you. Take care.